Valera crouched silently behind a dense outcrop of jagged stones. Her violet eyes narrowed as she observed the strange creature before her. It sat hunched by a flickering fire, its movements slow and deliberate, the sharp, acrid scent of charred flesh hanging heavy in the air. She gripped her weapon tightly, the cool metal steadying her trembling hands. The predator's lifeless carcass lay sprawled beside the fire, its massive jaws slack, fangs glinting in the light. This was no ordinary beast. It was Rakarath, the apex predator of her world, a being her people feared and revered in equal measure. Her mind reeled. The Rakarath were untouchable, creatures of legend that roamed unchallenged across the wastelands. Even her kind, the Arxen, had long since accepted that to confront one was a death sentence. Yet here sat the human, calmly slicing a piece of its roasted flesh as though it were nothing more than a common animal. It didn't even wear armor, its pale, fleshy skin exposed in places where its patchwork clothing had torn. By Arxen standards, it was frail, unimposing. And yet it had done the unthinkable. Valera's first instinct was to leave, to retreat into the shadows and pretend she had never witnessed such sacrilege. But something rooted her to the spot. Curiosity burned in her chest, battling with the ingrained fear and respect her people held for the predator. How had it done this? Had it used some advanced weaponry? Traps? She scanned the area, looking for signs of technology but found none. The human worked with nothing more than rudimentary tools, crude implements that seemed laughably insufficient for such a feat. The human paused, tilting its head as though sensing her presence. Valera froze, her breathing shallow. It turned its gaze in her direction, and for the first time, she got a clear look at its face. The features were angular, alien, yet there was something disarmingly calm in its expression. It didn't seem afraid, not even wary. Instead, it reached out, plucking another piece of flesh from the fire and holding it up as though offering it to her. Valera's stomach churned at the sight. The thought of consuming the flesh of the Rakarath was abhorrent, a violation of everything her people believed. And yet, she hesitated. The human's gesture was unmistakable. It wasn't a threat, nor a challenge. It was an invitation. Against her better judgment, she stepped out from behind the rocks, her armored boots crunching softly against the ground. The human didn't flinch. If anything, its expression softened, a faint curve to its lips suggesting amusement or welcome. She approached cautiously, her every muscle tensed, ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger. The fire crackled between them as she came to a stop, towering over the seated human. It didn't seem intimidated by her height or her armor, which bristled with biomechanical appendages designed for combat. Instead, it gestured again, holding the cooked meat closer. "I don't understand you," she said in her native tongue, her voice low and wary. The human tilted its head, as though recognizing her confusion, but made no effort to speak. She glanced down at the offering, the smell wafting up to her nostrils. Hunger gnawed at her. She had been out in the wastelands for days, her rations depleted. But this was unthinkable. The human broke off a smaller piece and placed it on the ground between them. Then it leaned back, hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. Valera's gaze flicked between the human and the meat. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, but something about the human's calm demeanor unsettled her resolve. Slowly, she knelt, her armor whirring softly as it adjusted to her movement. She picked up the piece of flesh, her fingers trembling. The meat was warm, its surface charred but the inside glistening with juices. With a deep breath, she brought it to her lips and bit down. The flavor was unlike anything she had ever tasted, rich, smoky, and strangely satisfying. Her stomach, long accustomed to the nutrient paste her people consumed, growled in approval. She swallowed, the act sending a jolt of guilt through her. What would her people say if they saw her now? She, an elite warrior of the Arxen, consuming the flesh of their most feared predator? Yet she couldn't deny the nourishment it provided, the strength it seemed to infuse into her weary body. The human watched her closely, a flicker of satisfaction crossing its face. It reached into a pouch at its side and pulled out a crude, hand-drawn map. Unfolding it, it pointed to a location, then to itself, then to the horizon. Valera frowned, trying to make sense of the gestures. It seemed the human was trying to convey its origin or perhaps its destination. The map was simplistic, lacking the intricate detail her people's cartography employed, but she recognized a few landmarks. The human had traveled far, likely through hostile terrain. That alone was impressive, though it didn't explain how it had taken down the Rakarath. "You're not what I expected," she murmured, more to herself than to the human. It responded with a faint smile, as though sensing her begrudging admiration. Her gaze shifted back to the carcass. The predator's massive frame was riddled with scars and fresh wounds. She could see now the signs of a struggle, deep gashes and punctures that suggested a brutal fight. The human must have used more than brute force to bring it down. Perhaps traps, or some form of cunning her people had never considered. The Arxen relied on their technology and their numbers, but this human seemed to operate differently. It was alone, unarmed save for its makeshift tools, yet it had achieved what her entire squad had once failed to do. A sudden sound in the distance snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned her head sharply, scanning the horizon. The human's posture stiffened as well, its eyes narrowing. Something was out there, and whatever it wasn't friendly. Without a word, the human rose to its feet, its movements fluid and purposeful. It reached for a weapon, a crude spear fashioned from local materials, and gestured for her to follow. Valera hesitated. Trusting an outsider went against her training, her instincts. But as she looked into the human's eyes, she saw no malice, only a quiet determination. For reasons she couldn't fully understand, she nodded and followed. The silence between them stretched as the human led the way, moving with an assuredness that baffled Valera. Every step it took seemed calculated, as though it were part of some greater plan she couldn't see. She trailed behind, her sharp eyes scanning the environment for signs of danger. The human's lack of armor still unnerved her. It seemed so fragile, so exposed, yet it walked through the wasteland as though it owned the very ground beneath its feet. The first wordless exchange had set a strange rhythm between them, and though she didn't fully trust this outsider, there was something about its calm demeanor that pulled her forward. The map it had shown her earlier suggested a path to the edge of the wastelands, a stretch of land her people rarely ventured into. That alone told her it was either incredibly brave or unfathomably reckless. As they walked, she couldn't help but notice the human's movements. It would pause every so often, crouching to examine the dirt or broken foliage, its hands brushing over small details she might have overlooked. Once, it stopped completely, kneeling by a faint impression in the ground. Valera watched as it traced the shape with its fingers before motioning her forward. When she joined it, she saw what it had found. A footprint. And not just any footprint. The massive claws and deep impressions were unmistakable. Another predator. Her blood ran cold. The Rakarath weren't solitary creatures, though they rarely traveled in groups. This must have been another of its kind, perhaps even its mate. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. If it was hunting them, they had little time to prepare. The human stood and gestured ahead, pointing toward a cluster of jagged rocks in the distance. Valera understood immediately. The rocks would provide some cover, perhaps even a defensible position if the predator attacked. She nodded, gripping her weapon tightly as they resumed their journey, moving faster now. When they reached the rocks, the human began working immediately. It pulled out a small, rusted blade and started cutting at nearby foliage, stripping the long, fibrous plants to create something she couldn't yet identify. She watched in silence, her curiosity battling with her skepticism. What could it possibly hope to achieve with such crude methods? Her people had spent centuries developing advanced weaponry, yet this creature seemed content to rely on scraps and instinct. After a while, the human paused and looked at her, gesturing for her to approach. It pointed to her weapon, then to the plants it had gathered. She frowned, unsure of what it wanted. The human mimicked the motion of tying something, pointing again to the plants. Realization dawned on her. It was asking for her help. With a reluctant sigh, She knelt beside it, her armor shifting as she moved, and began assisting. Together, they fashioned a series of rudimentary traps, the human guiding her through gestures and expressions. As they worked, Valera began to notice patterns in its behavior. The human's actions weren't random. Everything it did was part of a larger strategy. It had an uncanny ability to read the environment, to use every resource at its disposal. Her people relied on technology to achieve the same ends, but here was a being that accomplished it with nothing more than its hands and an unyielding will. It was humbling in a way she hadn't expected. When the traps were finished, the human stepped back to inspect their work. The arrangement was simple but clever, ropes and tension points designed to trip or ensnare anything large enough to trigger them. Valera couldn't help but feel a grudging respect. It wasn't the most elegant solution, but it would buy them time. The human turned to her and nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement that felt oddly significant. For the first time, she wondered if it viewed her the same way she viewed it, not as a threat but as an equal. The thought was unsettling, yet strangely comforting. The moment of quiet was broken by a distant sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Valera's heart raced as she turned toward the noise. The predator was close, its presence undeniable. The human moved immediately, gesturing for her to take cover behind the rocks. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stand and fight, but the human's urgency convinced her to comply. From her vantage point, she watched as it positioned itself near one of the traps, its spear held low. Its posture was relaxed but focused, every muscle coiled like a spring. The growl grew louder, closer, until the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Valera's grip tightened on her weapon as the predator emerged, its massive frame dwarfing even the largest Arxan warriors she had ever seen. The beast was larger than the one the human had killed earlier, its black scales gleaming in the dim light. Its eyes burned with a feral intelligence, its massive claws digging into the earth with each step. It was a nightmare made flesh, and for a moment, Valera felt the same fear she had known as a child, hearing stories of the Rakaratha's invincibility. But the human didn't flinch. It held its ground, waiting as the predator advanced. When the beast lunged, the human moved with lightning speed, sidestepping the attack and striking with its spear. The weapon glanced off the predator's scales, but the movement was enough to force it into one of the traps. The ropes snapped into place, wrapping around the creature's legs and pulling it to the ground. Valera seized the opportunity, leaping from her hiding place to join the fray. The predator thrashed against its bonds, its roars deafening. But she and the human worked in tandem, their movements synchronized despite the lack of communication. She struck at its exposed flanks while the human distracted it, the two of them chipping away at its defenses with relentless precision. The battle was brutal and unrelenting, each moment a test of their endurance and resolve. The predator's strength was staggering, its attacks nearly overwhelming, but together they pressed on, refusing to yield. For the first time, Valera understood what set the human apart. Its refusal to accept limits, its determination to find a way forward no matter the odds. When the predator finally fell, its massive body collapsing in a heap, Valera staggered back, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The human stood beside her, equally spent, its spear still clutched tightly in its hand. They exchanged a glance, and in that moment, no words were needed. They had survived. Together. The aftermath of the battle left the air heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of the scorched earth. Valera stood over the lifeless predator, her breathing labored, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at the human, who knelt by the beast's side, examining the remains with clinical precision. Its hands moved deftly, retrieving something from the predator's hide, a fong, or perhaps a shard of its scale. The human seemed almost ritualistic in its actions, as though it carried some deeper meaning. Valera found herself marveling at the contrast between them. Where her kind approached survival with technology and brute force, the human seemed to rely on something far more primal. It wasn't just skill or instinct. It was ingenuity, a relentless drive to adapt and overcome. That adaptability, she realized, was what had allowed it to accomplish the impossible. The human glanced up, catching her watching, and offered a faint nod of acknowledgement. There was no triumph in its expression, no arrogance, only quiet determination. It seemed almost oblivious to the enormity of what they had achieved together. To her, this was a moment that defied all logic and tradition, a feat her people would have deemed unattainable. To the human, it was merely survival. As the initial adrenaline faded, Valera became acutely aware of her own injuries. Her armor, designed to protect against most threats, bore deep gashes where the predator's claws had found their mark. Beneath it, her skin throbbed, and she felt the warmth of blood seeping from a wound on her side. She grimaced, pressing a hand to the injury, but refused to let her weakness show. The human, however, noticed immediately. It gestured for her to sit, its eyes narrowing with concern. "I'm fine," she said tersely, though the words rang hollow even to her. The human ignored her protest, reaching into a pouch and pulling out a small bundle of what appeared to be medicinal herbs. Valera watched in silence as it crushed the leaves into a paste, its movements efficient and practiced. Without hesitation, it reached for her side, and she stiffened, her instincts screaming against letting an outsider touch her. But there was no malice in its actions, only care. The paste stung as it was applied to her wound, but she held still, her pride battling with her growing respect for this strange creature. The human worked quickly, binding the injury with strips of cloth torn from its own clothing. The gesture was startling in its simplicity, yet it spoke volumes. Among her people, such an act would have been reserved for comrades or kin. Here it was given freely without expectation or demand. When it finished, the human leaned back, wiping its hands on the dirt before standing. It motioned for her to do the same, its expression unreadable. Valera hesitated, testing her weight on her injured side before rising to her feet. The pain was still there, a dull ache that pulsed with each movement, but it was manageable. She nodded her thanks, a small but significant gesture that the human acknowledged with a faint smile. They couldn't linger. The wastelands were unforgiving, and the scent of the predator's blood would undoubtedly draw scavengers. The human seemed to understand this as well, already gathering its tools and supplies. Valera followed suit, her movements slower than before but no less determined. Together, they left the battlefield behind, their pace steady as they made their way toward the edge of the rocky outcrop. The silence between them was no longer tense but companionable, a mutual understanding born from shared struggle. Valera found herself reflecting on the human's actions, trying to reconcile them with everything she had been taught. Her people viewed outsiders as inferior, beings to be avoided or subdued. Yet this human had proven itself not only capable but resourceful in ways that defied her expectations. It had risked its own safety to help her, despite having no obligation to do so. As they walked, the human reached into its pouch and pulled out a piece of dried meat, offering it to her. The gesture mirrored their first interaction by the fire, but this time, she didn't hesitate. She accepted the food, tearing off a small piece and chewing thoughtfully. It was tough and flavorless, a far cry from the nutrient paste her people relied on, yet it felt strangely satisfying. The human watched her as she ate, its expression contemplative. She wondered what it saw when it looked at her. An ally, an equal, or merely another obstacle in its journey? The question lingered in her mind, unanswered. Their path took them through a narrow canyon, the towering cliffs casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The terrain grew more treacherous, the ground uneven and littered with loose stones. Valera's injury slowed her, but she pushed forward, refusing to fall behind. The human, noticing her struggle, paused and extended a hand. She stared at it, her pride warring with practicality. In the end, she took it, her grip firm despite the ache in her side. They moved together, the human strength a steadying presence as they navigated the difficult terrain. For all its apparent frailty, it was remarkably resilient, its endurance matching her own despite the lack of any visible enhancements. It was another reminder of how little she truly understood about this strange species. When they finally emerged from the canyon, the landscape before them shifted. The barren wastelands gave way to rolling plains, the grass a dull greenish-gray that seemed almost lifeless. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of structures human-made by the look of them. It was a settlement, though far removed from anything she had ever encountered. The human paused, its gaze fixed on the distant structures. There was a sense of purpose in its stance, a quiet resolve that spoke of unfinished business. Valera didn't need to ask to know that this was its destination. She wondered what awaited it there. Safety, perhaps, or something far more dangerous. Whatever it was, it had driven the human to cross the wastelands and face unimaginable odds. That kind of determination was rare, even among her own kind. As they stood at the edge of the plains, Valera felt a strange sense of anticipation. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to face it. Not alone, at least. The settlement loomed closer with every step, its outline gradually sharpening into view. What at first seemed like a collection of rudimentary shelters revealed itself to be far more complex. Towers of scrap metal and wood jutted into the sky, their uneven structures somehow defying gravity. Smoke rose from several points, mingling with the faint hum of activity. It was alive, pulsing with the movement of a community. Valera found herself both wary and intrigued. Her people rarely ventured into human territories, and now she was walking straight into the heart of one. The human didn't slow. Its stride steady as though it had walked this path 1,000 times before. Valera followed, her senses on high alert. She noticed how the human's posture shifted slightly. Less guarded, more purposeful. This was its domain, a place where it held some measure of control, and it showed. For all her training and experience, Valera felt out of place here. A stranger in an unfamiliar land. As they approached the outskirts, the first figures came into view. Humans. They emerged from the shadows of the settlement, their movements cautious, their eyes wary. Most were clad in patchwork armor, weapons slung across their backs or held at the ready. Valera could feel their gazes on her, the weight of their scrutiny unmistakable. She tightened her grip on her weapon, ready for any sign of hostility. The human she had traveled with raised a hand, a subtle gesture that seemed to signal peace. The others hesitated, their suspicion evident, but they didn't attack. One of them, a tall figure with a scar running down the side of their face, stepped forward. Their eyes flicked between Valera and the human, their expression hard to read. Words were exchanged, quick and sharp, in a language she didn't fully understand. She caught fragments, enough to glean that the scarred human was questioning her presence. The human who had guided her remained calm, its tone measured. It gestured toward her once, then to the distant wastelands. Whatever it said seemed to carry weight, for the scarred one eventually nodded, though their expression didn't soften. They motioned for the others to lower their weapons, and slowly, the tension in the air began to ease. Valera remained silent, observing the interaction. It was clear that the human's presence here commanded a certain level of respect, perhaps even authority. She wondered what role it played within this group, what position it held to wield such influence. More importantly, she wondered why it had brought her here. The scarred human led them deeper into the settlement, their pace brisk. Valera noted the way the others watched her as she passed, their eyes filled with equal parts curiosity and mistrust. She couldn't blame them. To them, she was the outsider, a being from a species they likely viewed as a threat. Yet they didn't attack. Perhaps it was out of respect for the human who had vouched for her, or perhaps it was something else entirely. They were led to a central structure larger and sturdier than the rest. Inside, the air was cooler, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. The scarred human turned to face them, their posture rigid. More words were exchanged, this time in a tone that carried the weight of a question. Valera's guide responded in kind, its voice steady but firm. She watched as the conversation unfolded, piecing together what she could. They were discussing her, that much was obvious. Her presence, her purpose, the events that had transpired in the wastelands. It was all being laid bare. She didn't miss the way the scarred human's eyes narrowed as they listened, their skepticism evident. But when her guide finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. A decision had been made, though she wasn't entirely sure what it was. The scarred human turned to her, their expression inscrutable. They said something, a single sentence directed at her. Valera didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. They were granting her temporary acceptance, a chance to prove herself, or perhaps to justify her existence here. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging their words without breaking eye contact. It was a delicate balance, a display of both respect and strength. The interaction ended abruptly, and they were escorted out of the structure. Her guide walked beside her, its expression unreadable. For the first time, she felt the weight of her uncertainty pressing down on her. She didn't know what the future held, whether she would be accepted or cast out. But she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the same as she had been. The journey through the wastelands, the battle against the predator, and the partnership she had formed with this human had changed her. She was no longer just an Arxan warrior. She was something more. The settlement around them buzzed with life, the people going about their tasks with practiced efficiency. Valera observed their movements, noting the resourcefulness in their actions. These humans lived on the edge of survival, yet they thrived in their own way. It was a far cry from the structured, technology-driven society of her people, yet it carried its own kind of strength. Her guide led her to a quieter corner of the settlement, away from the prying eyes of the others. It gestured for her to sit, pulling out its makeshift map. Valera hesitated, then complied, watching as it traced a path across the parchment. It was a route, one that led beyond the settlement to a region she didn't recognize. The human tapped the map, then pointed to her, its meaning clear. It was offering her a choice, to stay or to continue her journey. The weight of the decision settled heavily on her. She had come this far, survived against impossible odds, and now she stood at a crossroads. To stay would mean accepting a place among these people, learning their ways and becoming part of their world. To leave would mean returning to her own kind, carrying with her the knowledge of what she had experienced. She looked at the human, searching its expression for guidance. But it offered none, its face a mask of quiet patience. This was her choice to make, and it would not influence her decision. For a moment, she envied its simplicity, the way it seemed to move through life with such clarity of purpose. But she knew that her journey was far from over. There were still questions to be answered, battles to be fought, and truths to be uncovered. Finally, she nodded, her decision made. The human seemed to understand, its faint smile returning as it rolled up the map. It reached out, clasping her forearm in a gesture of camaraderie. She returned the gesture, her grip firm, her resolve unshaken. They had walked different paths to reach this point, yet they stood as equals, bound by the trials they had faced together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the settlement in hues of gold and crimson, Valera felt a strange sense of peace. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she was ready. Whatever challenges awaited her, she would face them with the strength she had found within herself, and the lessons she had learned from the human who had shown her the way.